to see this turnabout in the last couple of weeks, it's unconscionable. Members of Congress are turning their backs on the best friend we have, not just in the Middle East, but in the world. And this is an unacceptable betrayal of a friend in order to appease a true enemy.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th and the surge in anti-Semitism in the United States, with a conversation with former Arkansas governor and presidential candidate Mike Huckabee to talk about both U.S.-Israel relations and Christian support for the Jewish state. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content, by going to jns.org or Telegram and subscribing. And now to today's program. Is America turning away from Israel? The answer to that question depends on which America you're talking about. In deep blue America, where credentialed elites dominate and people get their news from liberal corporate outlets like the New York Times or MSNBC, the answer is yes, it is. So-called progressives, deeply influenced by the myths of critical race theory and intersectionality, have become inveterately hostile to the Jewish state because they believe Israel and the Jews are white oppressors and settler colonialists, even though these are blatant falsehoods. But while the left-wing base of the Democratic Party was already a problem, since October 7th, the rot has spread. It is no longer just the anti-Semitic congressional squad that is openly anti-Israel. Since the largest mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, many other Democrats are also condemning Israel's efforts to defend itself and buying into the Hamas lies that are mainstreamed by the corporate media, influenced by the mobs in the streets and on college campuses calling for Israel's destruction. People like former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are calling for halting aid to Israel and falsely labeling its campaign to eradicate Hamas as genocide. In the space of 6 months, President Joe Biden has moved from a position of ardent support for Israel's response to the massacres to one in which he is threatening Israel with an aid cutoff if it tries to finish the job it began by attacking Hamas's last stronghold in Rafah. Like much of blue America, Biden is convinced he might lose his battle for re-election because he is insufficiently hostile to Israel. But there is another America where Israel is still supported and even loved. For the last generation, as the two parties basically exchanged identities on the issue, evangelical Christians have become the backbone of the pro-Israel movement in the United States. But in a time of surging anti-Semitism and demonization of Israel, the question is that support holding firm in the face of a troubling outbreak of anti-Semitism among some on the right? And is the organized Jewish community, whose mainstream groups have largely failed to do their jobs in standing up for Israel during this crisis, still ignoring or rebuffing Christian allies just when they are needed most? And how are they resisting the woke tide that is doing so much damage to American life? To discuss this, we're very honored to have with us today one of the leading conservative voices in the country, as well as a longtime Christian supporter of Israel. Mike Huckabee was governor of Arkansas from 1996 to 2007, and a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination in 2008 and 2012. He's the author of several books, the most recent of which are The Three C's That Made America Great, God, Guns, Grits, and Gravy, A Simple Government, and Do the Right Thing. A pastor and a veteran Christian broadcaster, he currently hosts the talk show Huckabee on the TBN network. Governor Mike Huckabee, thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to Top Story.
It's a pleasure, Jonathan, and a delight to be with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking the time. I want to start by asking you, as someone who has been following this issue your whole career, what you think of the current state of U.S.-Israel relations, with President Biden's threats last week to cut off military aid to Israel if it attempts to finish the job of defeating Hamas in its last Gaza strongholds. Are we at a breaking point, do you think?
We appear to be, and it's very troubling to me to see the president, who was so very clear and supportive in the early days after October 7th, and I was very proud of him and said so publicly, that he took a very decisive stand for Israel against the horrific butchering that Hamas inflicted upon the people of Israel on October the 7th. And to see this turnabout in the last couple of weeks, it's unconscionable, absolutely unconscionable. And I'm so distressed that not only the president, but Tony Blinken and other members of the administration, members of Congress, are turning their backs on the best friend we have, not just in the Middle East, but in the world. And this is an unacceptable betrayal of a friend in order to appease a true enemy.
Yeah, I think clearly that's true. And I think a lot of our coverage over the last 6 months has been sort of tracing the evolution or devolution, if you will, of the administration's position as they have gradually, sort of moved away from that initial very strong position of support to now where they're basically saying Israel shouldn't be allowed to win this war. Hamas must be kept alive. So I guess my question for you, how do you see, where is this coming from? What do you think is motivating this most of all? I know a lot of Democrats seem to believe that they are trailing in battleground states because the administration was too pro-Israel. It appears as if Biden thinks he has to topple Netanyahu before he can beat Donald Trump. Do you think they're right?
No, they're beyond wrong to think that. First of all, overwhelmingly, the American people support Israel in this. They're not stupid. They saw what happened October the 7th. They realized that to not eradicate Hamas means that basically you've allowed them to win. And we need to remind ourselves what Hamas did. They didn't launch a war against the Israeli military. They went against civilians. They broke through borders. They went on the holiest day of the week for the Jewish people, knowing they would be caught off guard. And they didn't just kill them bad enough. They butchered them, mutilated them, humiliated them. It was intended to inflict the greatest level of harm. And then they took over 250 hostages, 132 which are still being held hostage, 5 of which are American citizens. And one of the things that has perplexed me, Jonathan, is that this is a president who, with American citizens being held hostage, never mentions them, never demands that Hamas release those hostages, all of them, but especially the Americans. And there's been almost no coverage, no real attention being given to the fact that we are still waiting on word for what's happened to those hostages, that Hamas is still actively trying to kill civilians. It's not like they've just simply cowered in a fetal position and have been inactive since October the 7th. They're still hiding behind civilians. They're still trying to put civilians in front of them so that if there's any attack on Hamas, Hamas actually hopes that there will be civilian deaths among Palestinians in Gaza, because it gives them a reason to point fingers at Israel and blame them for what really is uniquely and solely the consequences of Hamas's not just criminal, but evil actions. And I tell people, this is not a political, sociological, economic battle. This is a spiritual battle. This is as clear a definition between good and evil as we have seen in our lifetime, and one of the most profound in all of history.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's almost really a turning point. I see it as part of this general battle we've been fighting in this country and elsewhere for the future of Western civilization. So I guess I want to dig down a little deeper as to what has really caused this turn among sort of left-wing Americans against Israel. Is it the influence of, critical race theory, intersectionality, which, promotes all sorts of terrible myths about America, but also about Jews and Israel? It basically grants a permission slip for anti-Semitism. Is it the media and their biased coverage, and a troubling surge in anti-Semitism, or some combination of all of those factors?
It's somewhat of a combination, but I think you put your finger on where this originates. And among people in Western civilization, not so much for the people of Hamas and the radical Islamists, but for the people of America who are out there chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They have no idea what they're even talking about. They're asking for genocide. They're asking for the slaughter of every Jew in Israel. This is insane. It's disgusting. But the critical race theory, I believe, is the underpinning of it all. And many people don't understand. The simplest way to describe it is this. In critical theory, whether it's critical race theory or just critical theory, intersectionality, there has to be this sense that there are only two classes of people, the oppressed and the oppressor. And if you can identify your opponent, your enemy, as the oppressor, then you are the oppressed, and therefore everyone should rally to you. So this is what has happened, and it's what has transpired. The irrational argument that people are making in the streets across Europe and in the United States to support the Palestinians, to support Hamas, even though when they're saying things that make no sense, it's like, we're queers for Palestine. And I'm thinking, why don't you take that sign over to any Palestinian community, take it to Gaza. You might last 15 minutes, if that long, until they find you. But they're not going to welcome you and thank you so much for your great support. We've seen this administration give such assistance to Iran to help them to rebuild their strength. At the risk of sounding overtly political, say what you will, but Donald Trump had as a policy not to bomb Iran, but to bankrupt them. And he was doing a darn good job of it. And by putting on second and third degree sanctions on Iran, it was bankrupting that country on the brink of their citizens being able to overthrow the evil that they've had to put up with since 1979. And more importantly, it bankrupted them to the point that they didn't have money to fund Hezbollah and Hamas. The Bidens come into office, start sending pallets of cash, releasing funds to the Iranians, opening up their energy markets, making them prosperous. And the next thing you know, what do you know? They're funding Hezbollah and Hamas, but they're not supplying milk and bread and warm places to sleep for the people. They're hoarding all of the aid. And what they're doing is they're building rockets to kill innocent civilians in Israel. And then they use the resources that they've been given by the UN and other of these feel-good organizations that are evil in themselves, and they use those funds to kill people. This is just, to me, it's
not to mention
is for this.
Building the moral equivalent of the New York subway system under Gaza.
Yeah. It's
with money that was supposed to be used for, obviously, for humanitarian concerns, not tunnels that are fortresses.
Yes, and educating children as young as 5 and 6 years old that the greatest calling in life is to kill a Jew. Well, this is just, it's unthinkable that anybody would look at this situation and do anything other than demand that Hamas surrender, that the hostages be released, and give Israel their 100% 100% support to eradicate this monstrous evil that threatens their very existence. I've been going to Israel since 1973. My first trip was in July of that year. I was 17 years old, a month away from my 18th birthday. I've been going for 51 years now to the land of Israel, probably close to 100 times. I've seen the remarkable transformation of Israel from a sleepy little country that could barely exist, its people having to live in kibbutzim and selling some Jaffa oranges and trying to get a handful of tourists so that they could build an economy, to becoming the technological envy of the world, to become an extraordinary nation of innovation, creativity, but also a nation of freedom, a nation of self-rule. I tell people, if you think we have free speech in America and we can criticize our government, you ought to go to Israel. My gosh, Israelis have made an art form out of being critical of their government, but they are allowed to elect their officials and then given the freedom to criticize them. Try that in Tehran. Try that in Gaza City. It doesn't end well. And I just wish more Americans understood that any sense of support for, I'll call them the so-called Palestinian people, because there really isn't such a thing. It's a term that was co-opted by Yasser Arafat in 1962. It was a geographical term before Arafat turned it into a term of ethnicity. It never has been, really isn't now. And it's become this sort of symbol for an aggrieved people. The truth be known, I'm amazed that most people aren't aware that there's a lot of freedom for people who are Muslim and Palestinian, if they identify that way, in Israel. There's not much freedom for a Jewish person in Saudi Arabia or almost anywhere in the Islamic world, even though the Islamics hold 644 times the amount of real estate as does Israel. So this nonsense talk about a two-state solution, my prescription for that would be, sure, let's have one. Tell me which part of the Islamist-controlled properties and territories would you like to carve out for that state? But it cannot be in the land that since the time of Abraham is land that God himself carved out for the Jewish people. Jonathan, I'm saying this not as a Jew. I'm a Christian, but I'm a Zionist. I'm an unapologetic, unreformed Zionist because I do believe that I do believe that the people of Israel deserve a homeland where they can feel secure, and it makes sense that that homeland be the homeland that they've had for the past 3,500 years.
Thank you for that expression, and that's very important for our audience to hear, as well as all Americans. But let me go back to something that we were talking about a moment ago, which is the influence of critical theory. And this idea that somehow controversies about race in this country, which are themselves, very toxic, this idea that we should be locked in this immutable, endless conflict over race, rather than trying to have a colorblind society. But that applying this to the Middle East is lunacy. Jews and Arabs are not different races. They're the same race. By the definitions of the American left, the majority of Israeli Jews are people of color because they trace their origins to the Middle East and North Africa, where all of the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa lost their homes after the creation of Israel. They were thrown out. And yet people don't understand this. And I think this in itself is a tremendous, ignorant point. But also the takeover of our institutions by these toxic ideas, it's a threat to American exceptionalism. And I think one of the things that has shocked people the most, certainly American Jews the most, since October 7th, is this terrible surge in anti-Semitism. Not just religious Jews, but liberal Jews, secular Jews are feeling it. And my question is, can American exceptionalism survive when our culture and institutions have been conquered by progressives and their new woke religion that seeks only to divide us, and which, as I said before, grants a permission slip to anti-Semitism?
Well, in a word, the answer to that is no, we can't. American exceptionalism won't exist, and it cannot thrive or even survive if we continue to punish ourselves with this nonsense that somehow we are a horrible country. Actually, what we are is a country that is far from perfect, but this country has empowered and prospered more people on the face of the earth than any country ever has in the history of mankind. One of the reasons that I'm so very supportive of Israel, even if I didn't have the spiritual and the deeply held biblical view of Israel being a land that God has blessed, and those who bless it will be blessed, those who curse it will be cursed. I believe that because it's in the book, and I'm a person of the book. But if I didn't believe any of that, if I was a non-religious person and had no affinity whatsoever for the Bible, then I would still come to the conclusion that Israel is the only bright spot of freedom and democracy and self-rule, basically not just in the Middle East, but pretty much from most of the mid-Atlantic all the way to the other side of Asia. This is an extraordinary oasis in a land of totalitarianism, surrounded by tyranny. And so I just wish more Americans understood the extraordinary contributions that Israel has made to all the world, not just to the Jewish world, but to all the world. And yet they don't. And the backwardness, the idea that many of the radical Muslims want to take us back to the 7th century. I don't want to go back there. I like modernity much more than I do this idea of giving up on all the things that have made our world and our lives better, more prosperous, more comfortable.
Well, you alluded to before the fact that polls still show a majority of Americans back Israel, and that has been a constant. But at the core of that support is the evangelical Christian community. That's something a lot of American Jews still fail to comprehend or acknowledge. But the question that even those of us who do appreciate Christian support is whether the evangelical community is still resisting efforts from the left and anti-Israel elements that seek to divide us. How rock solid is that support now? What's as you take the temperature of your own community, what are the sentiments you're hearing?
Well, Jonathan, generally, the evangelical community is rock solid in our support. And part of the reason for that, it goes back to our deeply held convictions that for us, this is a biblical issue. It is a biblical mandate. I remember a conversation I had with one of my very dear Jewish friends. He's from New York. We were in Israel together. I've often gone with him, and sometimes I would be the only non-Jew in a group of a couple of dozen people. And he asked me one time, how come it is that evangelical Christians are so supportive of Israel? And I think he was thinking, there's got to be an ulterior motive. And I said, it's pretty simple. You can be a Jew and have nothing whatsoever to do with Christianity. You don't need us. And you can fulfill all of your faith without any connection whatsoever to Christians. I, on the other hand, cannot be a Christian and sever the reality that my entire faith is built on the Bible and built on everything foundational that was Jewish in its origin. So I can't walk away from that. To do so would be to walk away from my faith itself. This is why I think that there is such a strong support. And sometimes I see stronger support from evangelicals toward Israel than I do from many American Jews, mostly the more secular.
You're not the only one who's noticed that. Yeah, I think that's quite true. And I think it is sad that there is, obviously sometimes there's a cultural divide between Jews and Christians in this country, especially when it comes where it's people who are not religious and don't understand people of faith. But it is an inspiring story, the support of Christians for Israel in the United States. I don't think it's properly understood, certainly not by the mainstream media, the corporate media, that obviously seeks to demonize Christians in other respects and always is looking to find ulterior motives where, as you say, there is none.
Without a doubt, that's the case. And through this process of the past several months since October the 7th, I think many of us as evangelical Christians want to make sure that our Jewish friends know, if you need us in any way, if we need to walk down the street with you to give you some sense of comfort and protection, if we need to show up at an event to stand with you shoulder to shoulder, I want to make sure our Jewish friends understand we're not going to say, hey, we're behind you, because that means, yeah, way behind you. We're going to say we're with you, shoulder to shoulder. We realize that it is imperative that as people of faith, that we stand with our Jewish friends and never let them feel like that they have been isolated or somehow abandoned. They cannot ever feel that way. And I know why they would, given the atmosphere, especially on some of our Ivy League campuses, which I find to be the most disgusting. Things that are being said on Ivy League campuses are the kind of things you would expect in some subcultural skinhead meeting, not among people who are supposed to be well-educated and sophisticated and even civilized.
Yeah, I think you've hit on something there, and I think it goes beyond expressions of support. And one of the things I've been writing about recently is that we seem to have abandoned, right-thinking people, Jews and Christians, seem to have abandoned the streets and the college campuses to hate mongers. There hasn't been enough of a presence resisting these marches, blocking bridges and tunnels, and even attacking synagogue or demonstrating at synagogues or just Jewish-owned businesses. And these people seem to have impunity. And there hasn't been a strong enough response, I think, from the Jewish community as well as the non-Jewish community.
Well, and I'm very distressed that the president, who gets heckled at speeches by the pro-Hamas faction, tends to reward that by now gravitating toward them, almost giving them license to continue to do it. I think maybe he believes that if he makes these concessions and begins to be critical of Israel, they're somehow going to start loving him again. I think he's naive to think that, because these people, they don't want peace. They're not interested in some type of resolution. They never have been. And if you go back, and I know you're certainly familiar, but my gosh, a lot of Americans don't understand that the Israelis have time and time and time again made concessions. They totally abandoned Gaza in 2005, moved 10,000 Jews who lived there, forced them by the Israeli military to leave their homes, gave Gaza over to the so-called Palestinians, who promptly turned around and elected Hamas to lead them. When the Oslo Accords were done, that was supposed to be a big peacekeeping moment. Well, it had the opposite effect, because Israel honored its part of it, but the so-called Palestinians never have. I remember going to Jacob's well, or Jacob's tomb, and I went with 12 other Israelis. I was the only non-Israeli, non-Jew in the group. We had to go at 2 o'clock in the morning. You could only go once a month. And we went there with armed military escort. There were tires being burned in the street. And this is a holy site for Jews, Christians, and maybe Muslims think it is for them too. But we didn't have access. But I watch Muslims have access to all of their holy sites in the land that's controlled by the Israeli government. And people don't give them credit for that. Well, I do. And to me, there's a stark difference, and people need to understand it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And when you hit on what President Biden is doing, I think that's a very important point, because he seems to be acting, I alluded to it before, to think that if he doesn't appease, basically Israel haters within his own party, he's going to lose the election. Now, I believe there are far more votes to be lost in the political center, where most Americans support Israel than on the far left, where they're probably going to vote for him anyway. And I think if he's going to lose Michigan, it's because, working class Americans don't like his policies on the borders and inflation. But what he seems to be doing is being part of something that certainly the mainstream media is implicated in as well, but mainstreaming expressions that we would have all understood as anti-Semitism, this sort of anti-Zionist, denying to Jews rights he wouldn't deny to anyone else. And yet he seems to think that he has to kowtow to it. And to politicians, whether it's the Squad or Rashida Tlaib or, the mayor of Dearborn, Michigan, where he sent, the deputy head of the National Security Council to apologize for his pro-Israel policies. There seems to be really, within the bubble of the White House, a belief that unless they do that, they're going to lose. And it seems to be motivating everything he's doing.
And it's a great tragedy because it's rewarding the most evil people that we see on the planet right now. What Hamas did can't even be described in mixed company for the most part. And I was there in December, and I visited with hostage families. I visited with survivors who lived through October the 7th. I've spoken with dozens of people for whom this was a life-altering moment. And when you hear the stories, you hear the atrocities that were inflicted, and then beyond as bad as the atrocities were, the pride, the celebration among the members of Hamas, they weren't just doing this and kind of being guilty over it. They did it with a great sense of glee and celebration. They were thrilled that they were able to just unmercifully kill people who are Jewish. And this is beyond anything I've ever witnessed in my lifetime. I've never seen people so gleeful about doing something so very evil.
Yeah, and you would think, especially when we think of the reaction in this country to the atrocities that ISIS committed, just a decade ago, and how that motivated even President Obama to try to do something about it. Yet there seems to be some indifference about, atrocities that are, if anything, far worse.
Far worse. As bad as the horrific crimes of ISIS were, they were generally targeted toward either journalists or people in the military. Even when it was civilians, there was not the level of glee, and neither did they go into the form of butchering, where women were just viciously raped in front of their own families, where infants were placed in ovens and were decapitated while in their cribs. These are the kind of horrors that are beneath any level of human, I guess, human capacity. I don't even know how to describe it other than these are evil deeds that are not the work of people who are aggrieved or people who feel that they have some political point to be gained. These are people who are just against the Jewish people in an irrational way that becomes beyond disgusting.
Yeah, I think that's true. Let me just turn to another aspect of this story and get your comment. I think for some of us, one of the troubling stories of recent months has been the seeming indifference or hostility to Israel mixed with what seems like tolerance for anti-Semitism, not from grassroots conservatives, but from some prominent talk show personalities, and I'll name the name, like Candace Owens. Mm-hmm. How troubled are you by this seeming break in what has been otherwise a nearly unanimous support during this crisis from conservatives?
It's been very troubling to me, and I don't understand it. I cannot get my arms around how anyone who will avail himself of easy-to-obtain information would approach this issue with anything other than unqualified support for Israel. I simply don't understand it. And I don't know if it's a spiritual darkness. I don't understand if it's just ignorance or if there's some sense of wanting to be the contrarian. But this is no time to play the game of contrarianism because lives have been lost and an entire people are being threatened from their very existence over this. And so I'm hopeful that there will be louder voices and more educated and more informed voices that will clearly dispel this notion that there are two sides here. There aren't two sides. This is not some point of equivocation. There is evil and there is good. We need to pick the right side.
Very true. I want to pivot back for a moment to politics. And one of the most interesting aspects of the 2024 election, at least to me, is how it seems to be illustrating the way the two parties are now representing very different constituencies than they did in the past, with Democrats now the party of the credentialed elites and Wall Street, while Republicans are becoming the party of the working class who listen to their concerns about open borders and inflation. You happen to be a Republican who spent your whole political career trying to appeal to working class voters and not the country club set that used to dominate the GOP. But I guess the question is, how did this transformation come about? And why do you think so many people in the corporate media are so slow to pick up on it and basically don't understand it?
Yeah, I was saying things in 2008 when I was running for president that got me pretty much panned by many of the traditional and more elitist Republicans. I was called a populist and that I was out of touch with our party. I think I was in touch with people who lifted heavy things for a living and who stood on concrete floors all day. I understood those people because that's where I came from, out of that sense of virtual poverty to living the American dream. But one thing that has happened, the Democrats have become the party of Wall Street, the party of the billionaires. And more grassroots Republicans are working class people who don't want the government to bail them out of anything. They just want the government to leave them the heck alone and let them live their lives and enjoy some liberty and freedom. And Jonathan, I so regret I'm going to have to close out. I'm running out of time, but I hope that just our conversation can encourage my Jewish friends in Israel and in the United States as well to know we are not going to abandon you. We are with you.
Governor Huckabee, thanks so much for joining us today and for your insights and for your support for Israel. And thank you for all that you're doing. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.